Hey everyone, my name is Nick and welcome back to my channel. In my last video I started building out the 3 different areas that the player can explore, as well as testing out some ideas for gameplay, and in this video I focused on continuing to add detail to the world, as well as some basic but essential code that needs to be in place. Once again, I do plan on releasing this game on itch.io for free, and it's definitely going to be a short game, but since this is my first complete game, and you guys are watching me learn as I build it, I thought it would be really fun to just share the results of my learning process with you, and hopefully you guys like it. I still do have plans for a much bigger game that I will release on Steam or whatever other platforms are available, I think, eventually. But it's always better to start small when you're figuring things out for the first time, as is the case with this game. Anyway, I hope you're all staying safe and washing your hands through this quarantine, and let's take a look at the updates that I've made thus far. So as I mentioned, there's going to be 3 areas that the player can explore. A sort of home scene, a sort of middle area that serves as a passage from the home scene to the field, and the field itself. So this is where I imagine most of the actual gameplay is going to take place, but it really depends as I go through the process of sort of building the story and figuring out what gameplay elements sort of work best given the particular area. So it evolves as I build it, and it's kind of fun to sort of change up your ideas as you come across better ones. But anyway, let's take a look at the home scene, and each of these scenes was built in a similar way. Like there's a bunch of different nodes that are essentially layers that contain different groups of sprites. So I'm going to break down how I actually layered up all the different groups and put the scenes together. In the very background of each scene, I currently have a texture rect, and the ground itself is just one big texture, or one big sprite. I'm not yet using a tile map, even though I think I'm going to move to that in sort of future games or even future versions of this game. But one big sprite currently works pretty well, so each of the scenes has one of these in the background. And sitting on top of the texture rect in the background is the collision shape that keeps the player within the boundaries of the particular area. So this is accomplished with a collision polygon 2D, and it's definitely a little bit more tedious than a regular sort of rectangular or square collision shape, and that's as a result of the fact that the texture rect, or the ground that the player walks around, has so many curves. But it works all right, and I think I get a good feeling for the edges of the boundary when the player is up against them. So once I have my background and these sort of collisions for the background set up, I start to add the various elements that are going to make up the scene that the player will be able to interact with. So in this case, that includes the house interior, which is actually its own sprite, the back of the house, the front of the house, which the player can go behind, which is why it's its own separate sprite sitting on top of the back of the house, any trees that the player is going to need to sort of pass behind, the plants that the player will be able to interact with in the scene. And this scene has a little garden in it, so I've separated out the trees, the plants, and the garden into their own individual nodes here in the tree, just to make it a bit more easy to keep track of everything that's going to be over here eventually. And any miscellaneous items I put in this misc sort over here, and each one of these is its own Y sort, and these are nested within the main Y sort of the scene, which is also where the player is going to be placed. And that just makes sure that everything is behaving according to the Y sort as the player and everything is added to the scene. So once I have my sort of main scene elements, I start working on the background and the foreground of the scene. So everything in the background sort, the player is always going to be in front of, and these are sitting outside of the collision shape. So the player doesn't actually get to interact with anything in the background, and the player is always going to be in front of that stuff. So it's kind of the reverse for the foreground. The player is always going to be behind the things in the foreground, and the player doesn't interact with these things because they're outside of the collision shape as well. So these are the main elements of the scene, and once I have everything in place, I start to add any sort of accent items that I want that I think could be cool. In this case, I have a couple lawn chairs, a fire, which I've shown off in a couple of my other videos, a home sign, which basically indicates to the player that the exit to this particular scene is in this direction, and a tree stump. So my overall philosophy is to build all the elements of the scene before creating any sort of story or gameplay, and I think it's kind of cool to do it that way because as I explore my environment, I sort of come up with gameplay and story elements on the fly, and it just makes for a bit more sort of dynamic creation process on my part. But anyway, that's the home scene. So let's take a look at some of the elements in the sort of middle and the field, and we'll start with the middle next. So the middle scene is constructed very similarly to the home scene and the field scene, but the one difference with the middle scene is that it has 2 exits instead of 1. So the game has to keep track of whether or not the player is coming from the home scene, which is over here to the left, or coming from the field, which is going to be over here to the right. A singleton, which is this code that's running in the background, is keeping track of which side of the screen the player is coming from. So let's take a look at that singleton. If I go to Project Settings, under the Auto Load tab, my script is called Scene Change, and that's the script that actually does the transitions for me. Close that and take a look at the scripts. Scene Change contains the actual scene changing script. So there's still a few bugs that I'm trying to work out, but currently I think it works pretty well. But in any case, I have a variable called coming from that updates depending on which screen or which area of the game the player is coming from. So if I'm coming from home and go into my home scene over here, if I'm exiting from home and going into the middle, that coming from variable is equal to home. And if I'm in the middle and that variable is equal to home, then the position of the player is set according to that variable. So it only needs to do this in the middle scene because the middle is the only one with 2 possibilities. In the home and the field scenes, there's only one place to enter and exit, so it doesn't need that logic. But it works pretty well. And like I said, there are a couple bugs I'm trying to work out, but I hopefully will be able to work those out as I continue to refine the scene changing system and how the game works. And finally, we have the field scene, which I think is the largest of the 3 scenes that the player will be able to walk around in. And I think it's going to be the most sort of graphically intensive scene. There's a lot of moving sprites in this scene, and hopefully it's not going to cause too much of a performance problem. I think performance optimization is something I'm going to have to work on like as the game comes together and probably closer to it being finished. But since this is a 2D game, I'm not anticipating like that many performance problems, but still, I'll see what I can do to make sure it runs smooth on even older machines. So at this point, you've probably noticed that there's a lot of sort of swaying plants, and in this scene, both the flowers and the trees have it applied. And this isn't actually an animation, like an animation player node or anything like that. This is accomplished with a shader, and this is the first time I've actually used shaders to animate or sort of create any effects for any of the nodes and sprites in the game. But let's take a quick look at that shader. So there's only one tree sprite or one tree sort of scene that I'm using throughout the game. I'll show you how I've sort of changed the way it looks each time it's instanced. But here's the shader and the effects that it creates. But let me open up the code itself. Now, I'm still very new to sort of shader programming, so I don't actually understand what any of this means. I basically just copied and pasted a sort of freely available shader that I thought would work, and it has a bunch of parameters that you can set, so you can change the strength of the swaying and stuff like that. For example, if I change the sort of minimum or maximum strength to something like that, then you can see it immediately enhances the way that the tree moves. So it has a bunch of really useful parameters. Again, I'll link the shader in the description below, but it creates a really cool effect and looks really useful, I think, for giving the feel of wind moving through the trees. Now, this is actually the exact same shader I'm using for the flowers. So if we take a look at one of the flowers here, it just has some different parameters, so it doesn't sway quite as extremely, but I think it does a good job of conveying that sort of wind moving through the grass and stuff feeling. And as you can see in the flower, there still is a collision shape, and there still is an animation player node in this scene. And as you'll see, when my player sort of moves through the flowers, it still plays this little sort of sway animation when the player moves over it. So in addition to the shader, there's that animation. It just gives that little bit of extra sort of tangible interaction that the player has with these kinds of scene elements. As I mentioned, there's only one tree scene in the entire game, just copied a bunch of times. And I've done some sort of basic modulation to give it different colors, and in the case where you can see the trees are swaying in different directions, that just is the same scene flipped on the X axis. So if I go back to my tree scene here, if I want to change the color of the leaves or anything like that, then you just go to the visibility section over here in the inspector, and you change the value in modulate. And you can get some pretty good variation in terms of the way or the color of the trees just by playing around with the color in the modulate section over here. And again, if I'm just trying to make it sway in the opposite direction, I'll flip it on the x-axis using a transform. So I think it creates a pretty convincing sort of swaying forest effect. It doesn't look like all the trees are looking the same and all swaying in the same direction. So when you're down sort of at the zoom level of the player, I think it looks pretty cool. Another thing you may have noticed as I walk around the scenes here is that I have a frame rate counter in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, but that's currently using VSync. Let me give you an idea of what the performance is when I turn VSync off. So hopefully you can hear that. That's my laptop fan. It kicks into high gear whenever I put this on full screen. Hopefully that doesn't indicate any sort of weird performance issues, but this is a kind of gaming multimedia laptop, so it kind of does that when any sort of GPU intensive program is being run. But as you can see, the frame rate is pretty high. I'm hoping it stays above 1,000 when it's not in VSync mode, depending on what computer it's running on, I guess. And not that you would need to have those kind of frame rates to actually play the game, but I'm just trying to gauge the actual performance of the game. So here we are in what I think is probably the most graphically intensive, at least at this point in development, area of the game. And you can see the frame rate is a little bit lower than the other areas. I used to have like really densely clustered patches of flowers, and the frame rate went down to maybe about 800 or something like that when VSync was not being used. So that definitely indicates to me that this is a little bit more graphically intensive with all the shaders and sort of animations running, but hopefully when everything's done it won't be that much of a problem, because I'm really only aiming for 60 around there FPS, and you really don't need that much more than that to play this game well, so we'll see. I don't really have any access to different kinds of GPUs to test this on, but I'm gonna do a little bit of extrapolation to see what I can come up with in terms of what is the minimum specs that this game will be able to run on. Alright everyone, thank you for watching. I think that about does it for this video. Hopefully I'll be able to produce a few more videos more quickly since I'm home during the day because of the quarantine. But I hope you're all doing alright. Stay safe, wash your hands, probably stay indoors, and I hope to see you in the next video. Please leave a like if you like the video and maybe consider subscribing, and thank you all for watching.